Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are tearing into the news that just absolutely rocked the foundation of the entertainment. The sudden and, frankly, shocking announcement that Netflix has succeeded in its bid to acquire the core assets of Warner.
Yeah, this isn't just big news. It is truly seismic. You hear talk of industry disruption all the time, but this deal it's existential.
It really is.
Industry insiders are already calling this the funeral death of Hollywood, which, that tells you everything you need to know about the fear and the sense of finality around this.
Wow.
The feeling among, some of the creative community is that the worst case scenario they've been warning about for years it's just materialized.
So our mission today is simple, but it's absolutely crucial. We need to get a really thorough and deep understanding of the specific structure of this monument. Then there's the fierce political and corporate opposition from rivals and from Washington. And maybe most importantly, the massive cultural and economic implications for the movies, the theaters, and the huge franchises you actually love to watch. We're diving deep into dozens of sources, filings, insider notes, everything that's surfaced.
Right. And I think let's start with the basics of what was actually purchased.
Yeah.
Because the financial structure here is it's pretty complicated. So Netflix has entered into what's called a definitive agreement to acquire the Warner Brothers Film and Television Studios, HBO Max, and HBO itself.
So the crown jewels.
The crown jewels. The century-old legacy of storytelling assets now moving under the umbrella of a streaming service that only started making its own original content, a little over a decade ago. It's wild.
And the money involved here is just staggering, but you have to understand the technical distinction in the numbers around.
That's a great point.
The reported transaction is valued at $82.7 billion, but that figure is the enterprise value.
Right.
The equity value, what Netflix is actually paying the shareholders, is closer to $72 billion because they're also assuming the debt load of the acquired assets.
Exactly. When you see plus debt in a corporate filing, that just means Netflix is now responsible for all the borrowing that the studios and streaming platforms already had. So they're paying the $72 billion, yes, but they're also taking on all those financial obligations, which brings the total value up to that $82.7 billion.
And that instantly puts pressure on them. They have to find enormous synergies and cost savings to justify that kind of investment.
Immediately.
And an investment that big implies a very long and contentious road ahead. The sale is not finalized. It won't be for quite some time.
No, not at all.
It has to pass a lengthy regulatory process with domestic and international bodies, with an expected closure timeline stretching all the way to Q3
2026. So this isn't happening overnight, and the opposition, as we're about to get into, is already lining up with legal challenge.
So the immediate stake here is incredibly high. Netflix is essentially buying one of the largest studios with the deepest history. A legacy that maybe only Disney can compare to in terms of cultural footprint. And the fear is they're just stripping it of its assets to be mined for intellectual property, for IP.
One source compared it to giving your prized, polished, classic car to a parts dealer and expecting them to keep it nice. You know full well they're just going to strip it down to sell the individual component. The goal is efficiency, not preservation.
And what's fascinating here, and something I think a lot of people are missing, is that this deal isn't for all of Warner Bros. Discovery. It's a highly strategic separation.
That's right. WBD, under CEO David Zaslav, is essentially splitting itself in two.
How does that work?
Well, the entertainment half, so the studios, the physical lot, the film archives, HBO Max, HBO, that all goes to Netflix. The other half, which the filings are calling Discovery Global, houses the less IP-rich assets. Think cable channels, TLC, Food Network, CNN. That gets spun off into a new publicly traded company.
So this separation is key. It lets the Netflix deal be laser-focused on acquiring the maximum IP.
Maximum IP. And leaves Zaslav and his management team to go back to running the cable-centric Discovery side, having successfully sold off the debt-ridden Warner half just a few years after they bought it themselves.
So a calculated exit.
A very calculated exit that prioritizes the sale of the most valuable components, which is exactly what Netflix wanted.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's talk about the absolute treasure chest of IP that Netflix just bought. It's hard to overstate the cultural gravity of this catalog.
It's an instant acceleration of Netflix's legacy. Overnight, they gain ownership of the entire DC universe. That's Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, the whole Rogues Gallery, and crucially, the future film and TV plans that DC Studios has under James Gunn.
Right.
Then they get the Wizarding World, Harry Potter, Fantastic Beasts. That's a franchise with built-in global appeal that Netflix desperately needed. And don't forget, they also get the rights to the Middle-earth titles produced through New Line Cinema, like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
So they've just acquired the foundation of modern multi-billion-dollar franchise filmmaking.
Instantly. It makes them a major player on the cinematic IP front right alongside Disney.
And it's not just the modern blockbusters, right? It's an entire archive of cinema history.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the classics that Ted Sarandos, the Netflix CEO, specifically cited in his announcement. Titles like Casablanca, Citizen Kane, 2001, A Space Odyssey, The Maltese Falcon. This instantly gives Netflix a cinematic legacy and a prestige that they just did not possess before.
Yeah.
It helps them compete with the old guard studios on pedigree.
And that historical depth, it continues into modern genre cornerstones.
For sure, they get huge franchises like The Matrix, Mad Max, Lethal Weapon, even key parts of the horror genre with A Nightmare on Elm Street and The Exorcist. When you combine that with the prestige drama that HBO brings, you realize Netflix just bought not just content, but culture itself.
The TV side is just as colossal, if not more important, for their immediate stream.
I'd say more important, yeah. They get procedural and sitcom giants like the long-running The Big Bang Theory, prestige hits that define the golden age of TV like The Sopranos and The Wire, and of course the perennial global streaming hit. These are shows that just drive huge catalog viewing hours.
Plus the kids and animation sector, which I feel like gets overlooked. Looney Tunes, Hanna-Barbera, Cartoon Network. That's a massive infusion of cross-generational content for every demographic.
Right. So you have to look at this from a defensive and an offensive perspective. Netflix has always been known as a disruptor, a builder.
Yeah.
So why did they pivot and become the ultimate buyer?
Big question.
Well, Ted Sarandos explained their core motivation by saying their mission has always been to entertain the world. He says they'll do it by combining Warner Brothers' incredible library with Netflix's culture-defining titles like Stranger Things and Squid Game.
Their primary stated goal remains consistent then. Drive subscriptions and deliver first-run movies to our members. Sarandos was really hammering that point, that they'll be able to give audiences more of what they love and define the next century of storytelling even better with these assets.
But the real, the deep business reason for the $82.7 billion move seems to be filling a huge internal structural weakness that Netflix executives have been quietly admitting to. The acquisition is intended to address Netflix's quite shallow development pool by incorporating WBD's century of development infrastructure.
That's a huge admission. Is the company known for spending tens of billions on content is now admitting that while they can throw money at a project, they lack the foundational system.
They've only been in original content for a decade, and they rely heavily on algorithmic suggestions for greenlight. WBD provides 100 years of established machinery, creative executive talent, script development, and the deep network of relationships within Hollywood that Netflix struggles to replicate from scratch.
So they're essentially buying the institutional memory of how to run a major Hollywood.
That institutional depth is the critical point. Netflix can greenlight a lot of shows, but they don't have that deep, century-long tradition of studio development of franchise planning that Warner Bros. Had. As the co-CEO Greg Peters claimed, they are buying the machinery of Hollywood creation to accelerate their growth for decades to come.
And that gives them a huge advantage over rivals like Amazon, who've had to build their studio infrastructure from the ground up with, mixed results.
For sure.
And let's not ignore the immediate economic upside and the promise of, brutal cost cutting, which is always the uncomfortable flip side of these massive mergers.
Right. They want to attract and retain members using these new libraries, but they also anticipate realizing at least $2 to $3 billion in cost savings per year by the third year.
And that $2 to $3 billion figure is the part that raises alarms all over Hollywood. When you hear cost savings on that scale in a merger, it immediately translates to
massive system-wide layoffs, eliminating huge duplicative overheads across HBO Max, WBD Film, and their own streaming division. The executives are focused on maximizing shareholder value by achieving those savings, but it means thousands of jobs, development execs, marketing staff, animation artists are now potentially redundant.
Which is exactly why those A-list producers are so worried about an institutional meltdown.
Exactly.
There's also a fascinating, very modern expert insight about a strategic, future-facing component of this acquisition. It goes beyond just traditional sequels and reboots.
Yeah, this is where it gets a little sci-fi. One source suggested that the sheer scale of the WBD library, that massive century of content, could provide AI supercharger training data and meme materials for algorithmic content creation.
Okay, break that down. What is that actually?
This is where we shift from traditional economics to the bleeding edge of content tech. We're used to companies buying IP for sequels and spin-off, but in the current digital age, a vast, cataloged, and historically successful content library is maybe the most valuable training data set a tech company could ever acquire.
I've never thought of it that way.
Well, think about it. Warner Bros. Content has been labeled, analyzed, and categorized for decades based on box office, critical review, cultural impact.
So Netflix isn't just buying old movies. They're buying highly valuable, highly successful historical data point. The data tells an AI exactly what works, how to pace successful drama, which plot structures resonate,
and which IPs generate the most social engagement. entertainment, or meme material. Exactly. If the long-term goal for streaming companies is to move toward automated or heavily AI-assisted content designed to optimize retention, this library is the perfect raw material. It allows them to train models to produce new content that replicates the success patterns embedded in classics like The Matrix or Game of Thrones, but without the massive slow development cost.
That is a very unsettling thought, but you can see how it's strategically brilliant from a tech perspective.
It is.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The road to this deal was fraught with conflict. This was a fiercely contested sale that spurred allegations of foul play and raised serious antitrust flags right away. Netflix didn't just win, they won under intense scrutiny.
It was absolutely a true bidding war. You had Netflix, Comcast, and Paramount Skydance. And Paramount, led by Skydance CEO David Ellison, was the most aggressive rival.
Yeah.
And their opposition has been very public. They're making their case directly to the WBD board and now to regulators.
Paramount's rival bid was important because it was structured completely differently, right? It offered a stark alternative vision for Warner Bros.
Totally different. They offered an all-cash deal, $27 per share for the entire including the cable channel. They argued this provided maximum and certain value to stockholders immediately.
And their pledge was a direct contrast to Netflix's well-known anti-theatrical stance.
That direct contrast, yeah. Paramount specifically pledged to keep Warner Bros. Operating as a standalone entity that would make a minimum of 14 films per year theatrical. They were positioning themselves as the saviors of old Hollywood, trying to preserve the traditional studios.
But the WBD board apparently favored the Netflix bid, which led heated protests from Paramount.
Right. Paramount sent multiple strongly worded letters to the WBD board alleging the process was unfair and myopic, with a predetermined outcome favoring Netflix. They cited media reports of WBD management enthusiasm for the Netflix deal, with some WBD statements calling it a slam dunk while referring to Paramount's bid in a negative light publicly.
And this internal corporate fight, it quickly escalated into international, and Paramount made a specific, explosive allegation that's now known as the Brussels allegation.
Yes, this is where it gets very cloak and dagger. They alleged that WBD executives had engaged in underhanded secret meetings with an EU commissioner in Brussels.
Tell us more about the mechanics of that. What were they allegedly doing?
The sources suggest that WBD executives, eager to see the Netflix deal go through, were meeting with European Union regulatory bodies to raise concerns about the ownership and financing of David Ellison's Paramount bid. Since the Ellison family has deep ties to Oracle and International Holding, WBD was allegedly trying to plant seeds of doubt with EU regulators about whether the Paramount deal would even pass European antitrust scrutiny.
So they were trying to undermine its viability before the WBD board could seriously consider it.
That's the allegation. It's a sophisticated legal chess move attempting to kill the rival bid via international regulation before it could gain traction at home.
And Paramount's aggressive fight just highlights the severity of the regulatory resistance Netflix now faces.
It does. The primary concern revolves around market share in the streaming. And let's clarify a term here, SVOD, or subscription video on demand. If the Netflix merger goes through, the combined entity would control close to half of the SVOD streaming market globally.
And domestically, it would push them above a 30% share, which is a level traditionally viewed as presumptively problematic under antitrust.
That 30% mark is historically a huge red flag for the government. The Paramount letter also specifically cited a potential 43% share among global SVOD subscribers, arguing this is presumptively illegal under U.S. law because it just kills competition.
And this isn't just a regulatory technicality. It's drawn immediate, strong, and importantly, bipartisan political opposition. And we are reporting impartially here, but the sources show a very strong pushback from both sides of the aisle.
It's a rare moment of agreement in Washington. It shows you the gravity of this.
Absolutely. Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat, publicly called the deal an anti-monopoly night. She argued it threatens to force Americans into higher prices, fewer choices, and puts American workers at risk through mass layoffs.
And this concern echoes across the political spectrum. On the Republican side, you have Representative Darrell Issa writing a letter to the Justice Department. He argued that Netflix already wields unequaled market power and that adding HBO Max's content would just cement that position. He directly stated the deal would diminish incentives to produce new content because the new giant would face less pressure to innovate.
The industry itself is equally terrified, so much so that they are lobbying Congress anonymous. We're hearing about anonymous A-list film producers who reportedly feared immediate economic retribution from Netflix lobbying Congress via an unsigned open letter.
The fact that the letter was unsigned speaks volumes about the power Netflix already holds. They are the single largest content buyer and distributor in the world. These producers warned that a Netflix merger would effectively hold a noose around the theatrical market and urge the highest level of antitrust scrutiny.
They're worried about being blacklisted. If they speak out public, you consolidate the buyers, you consolidate the power over the entire creative class.
Right. Now, Netflix and WBD, they're not naive. They know this will be scrutinized heavily by the DOJ. They're reportedly prepared for a multi-year legal battle with regulators, and their potential legal defense is extremely interesting.
What's the strategy?
Arguing that their biggest competitor is not other studios or streamers, but broader platforms like YouTube.
YouTube, that's a clever strategy, but it feels like a legal sleight of hand.
It is. By framing the merger as necessary to compete in the broader digital landscape against a giant like YouTube, which is statistically very competitive for viewing time, they try to downplay the monopoly within the traditional studio world. They're saying, look at the whole pie, not just our slice of Hollywood.
But isn't that a calculated risk? Because I seem to recall Netflix executives telling investors in the past that they differentiate themselves with high-value content compared.
You're exactly right. On their investor calls from a few years ago, they consistently told Wall Street that YouTube wasn't direct competition. Those past statements could definitely come back to haunt them in court. The whole strategy hinges on whether a judge accepts this broadened definition of market competition.
This raises an important question. What does this deal mean for the creative process itself? The sources we have are very pessimistic. They're linking this consolidation directly to a structural decline in quality.
The primary argument is that the shift to streaming subscriptions fundamentally destroyed the historic put-up or shut-up system that had been in place for decades. This was a competitive system supported by government antitrust acts in the late 1940s, where studios had to constantly produce quality content to win at the box office or get high network rate. Otherwise, they failed.
Before streaming, the fear of failure drove quality and innovation. If your movie was bad, you lost money immediately, executives lost their job. But with streaming, suddenly you have this consistent, endless revenue stream coming in every month from millions of subscribers who signed up for one hit show and just kept paying.
That consistent, predictable income meant companies no longer had to wring their hands over whether the next movie would succeed. It allowed them to produce vanity projects or just mediocre content, as long as people remained subscribed for other things like Friends or Stranger Things. The financial incentive for high quality was severely damaged.
And this lack of accountability leads directly to the fear surrounding Netflix's anti-theatrical philosophy. Ted Sarandos insisted Netflix has no opposition to theaters, that WBD films will continue to have a life there. But he immediately clarified that his pushback is against long exclusive theatrical window, which he deems not consumer-friendly.
Right. He views the old model, a movie in theaters for 90 days, as outdated. His priority is the paying subscriber who wants access now. He expects the windows to evolve to be much more consumer-friendly, quicker, to meet the audience where they are. His primary goal, he was clear, is to bring first-run movies to our members. That puts streaming value way over theatrical longevity.
This is the concrete threat. Sources are telling us they fear theatrical windows will shrink to as thin as 2 weeks of exclusivity before hitting streaming.
2 weeks, that just destroys the model. It reduces the time theaters have to recoup their investment and limits the time a movie has to build cultural buzz as an event.
The core concern here is the devaluation of movies as an event. Theaters gave movies value. It was a special communal experience that incentivized high craft.
As one source argued, once a movie is digitized and becomes just another disposable catalog or streaming content, its value is devalued. The experience is no longer special. It's something you throw on in the background while you're on your phone.
And this pursuit of disposable content over high craft has led to what's being called second screen content. This is truly concerning because we have literal sources confirming that Netflix has been sending instructor production team dumbed down shows by having characters explain super obvious plot.
It's credible. The reason they do it is because Netflix is already anticipating and even encouraging that viewers will be scrolling their phones while watching the second screen.
They need somebody on screen to actually explain what's happening because the audience isn't paying full attention.
Exactly. Instead of letting a tense visual scene convey that a character is angry, they instruct the writer to add a line where another character says, "Wow, you seem really angry." So the viewer, glancing up from their phone, catches the emotional state. It just undermines high-level craft, visual storytelling, and nuance.
And this fear is particularly poignant because WBD had recent tangible success operating under the traditional model that Netflix is now threatening. Despite a tough year at the box office for the industry, WBD was the first studio to hit $4 billion cumulative box office in 2025.
That $4 billion figure proves the traditional model still works for them. That hard-won success, built on event filmmaking like Dune, is now potentially threatened by a company whose business model dismisses the long theatrical window, the very thing that generated that success, as not consumer-friendly.
The conflict is just immediate.
It is.
So what does this all mean for the things you actually love to watch? Let's start with the crown jewels of the acquisition, Harry Potter, perhaps the most valuable single IP they bought.
For sure. Netflix now owns the core Harry Potter Wizarding World IP. Sarandos featured it prominently in his statement. They get all the existing movies and the underlying literary assets.
And the planned HBO Harry Potter TV was already confirmed for 2 seasons. That will almost certainly shift to a Netflix production.
It will. And this is actually seen as potentially good news for a global audience. Netflix has a worldwide footprint, unlike HBO Max, which had complicated regional license. So the show will have immediate legal distribution to a much wider international audience.
But this is where it gets complicated very quickly. Because Netflix's typical strategy of wanting to rapidly exploit and monetize their investment, wanting to reboot, reimagine, or expand the universe with fan-favorite spin-offs, that runs straight into the J.K. Rowling.
It really does. Rowling's contract, which she negotiated decades ago, grants her significant and unusual creative control. This includes script approval, some influence over casting, and merchandising. The Wizarding World trademark is famously shared between her and Warner Bros.
And that level of creative control is extremely rare. It absolutely guarantees power structure.
A huge one. Netflix bought the IP for $82 billion to expand it rapidly. But any major expansion, say a prequel series about the Marauders or a major recast for a new film trilogy, has to pass Rowling's desk. A major conflict between Netflix trying to rapidly monetize their investment and Rowling, who retains final creative say, seems not just possible, but likely.
And beyond the screen content, Netflix may also gain control of ancillary assets, like the theme parks and Porky games, which made the billion-dollar hit Hogwarts Legacy.
Yes, and controlling those massive revenue generators makes the IP even more valuable. They will want to tightly integrate those revenue streams with their streaming output.
Okay, let's move to the DC universe, the crown jewel of comic book IP. What's the immediate there?
The fear is content mine. Producers worry that DC franchises like Batman and Superman will be stripped down and become just more streaming content, diminishing their cinematic event value. The fear is DC studios will be reduced to a name brand, and the IP will just be blended into the overwhelming, disposable Netflix content mix.
And sources are expressing deep anxiety over Netflix's history with adaptations and the perceived direction of their politically or culturally charged content. And again, we're reporting impartially here. This reflects the view of certain sources that this direction prioritizes social messaging over established canon.
To contextualize that fear, these sources point to recent trends in the comics. They cite examples like a recently introduced gay Superman and a gay Robin. They predict that Netflix, given its history, would be more likely to push these themes aggressively into the very high-profile DC film and TV slate. The anxiety among these traditional producers is that the IP will enter a content cycle where DEI metrics and social messaging are prioritized over maximizing universal box office appeal.
Now, let's look at 2 critical areas facing a massive redundancy risk that aren't franchise. Cartoon Network and DC Comics print publishing. These represent parts of the business that just don't fit the Netflix.
Not at all. Cartoon Network Studios, which was already consolidated under Warner Bros. Animation, will likely be merged into Netflix Animation. While Netflix promised Warner Bros. TV will continue producing for outside buyers, the reality is this is a classic case of merger redundant. They'll consolidate departments, leading to anticipated job losses and fewer independent creative voices.
But the fate of DC Comics as a physical print publisher is maybe the most precarious and fascinating element.
It really is. Sources are highly skeptical that bankrolling a traditional monthly print industry for a dwindling audience makes sense to the Netflix business model. Netflix has no history, interest, or infrastructure for running a complex print operation that generates minimal returns compared to streaming.
So what's the speculation?
2 routes. First, they outsource the entire print operation, possibly to a third party like Dark Horse or Image. The second, more radical speculation is that they switch DC Comics to a digital-only format, integrated directly into the Netflix app. Netflix wouldn't waste money supporting a print in, but they still want the creative pipeline that produces new stories and characters for their streaming.
On a brighter note for animation fans, the sources suggest the merger might finally result in the entire Cartoon Network and Hanna-Barbera archive being made available on Netflix.
Yeah, that would be a massive volume of beloved classic content, everything from the Flintstones to Dexter's Laboratory that was often siloed and unavailable before.
Okay, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to discuss the unintended consequences of the bidding war itself, which Paramount ignited in the first place.
The sheer irony is that Paramount's aggressive bidding war, spearheaded by David Ellison, may have unintentionally driven up the sale price, and in doing so, helped create a much larger, more potent competitor for their own movie studio. He was trying to save Hollywood, but may have ended up making the final consolidation inevitable and more expensive.
This deal really confirms the accelerating trend toward what's often called a Netflix, Disney, Amazon world, where fewer voices control more IP.
It's the new reality. It's not about competition. It's about control.
And while executives promise more opportunities and job creation, the industry consensus strongly fears the massive job losses, reduced output, and a stagnation of creative risk. These companies are striving for high returns on their massive investment through intense cost cutting, rarely foster.
And that decline of quality, as we discussed, stems directly from this structural shift away from accountability. The competition was destroyed when the goal shifted from ticket sales to subscription retention.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. The source material notes that the pursuit of subscriptions destroyed the old company, leading to a decline in quality where content is often made disposable background, that infamous second screen. If Netflix's primary goal is to keep you subscribed by providing an endless stream of content, and if they view long theatrical release, the very thing designed to build value and demand your full, undivided attention, as not consumer-friendly, what kind of vital, high-craft, event-driven cinematic experience, the kind that require you to put your phone down and step into the dark communal space of a theater, will simply become obsolete in this new, consolidated market?
That's the question we are left with as the funeral death of Hollywood begins and the machine takes over. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.